What is a cromlech?
Translated from Celtic. The word cromlech means circular place and refers to a circle of standing stones. Cromlechs are either circular or semicircular arrangements of megaliths. There are many theories about the function of these large-scale Neolithic sites, including the idea that they served some kind of religious function. However, like the menhir alignments in France, cromlechs remain a mystery.
What is op art?
The op in op art refers to optical illusion and op art paintings, such as Bridget Riley's Metamorphosis, 1964, are composed of precise, geometric abstractions. Op art paintings pulse with an energy created by a strategic alignment of color and form, creating a blurring afterimage. Similar to the experience of looking at a bright light for too long, or looking into a funhouse mirror. Hungarian artist Viktor Vásárhelyi, 1908–1997, was a pioneer of op art. His commercial paintings of zebras, and their repetitious black and white stripes, served as early optic experimentations, while works such as the black and white supernovae, 1959–1961, are dynamic and restless. Vásárhelyi linked these works to free-moving kinetic art by artists such as Alexander Calder. The viewer is an essential part of the op art experience because without the viewer, specifically the viewer's perception, there can be no optical illusion. Op art serves as an inquiry into the very nature of optical perception, the experience of seeing things.
What is the significance of ball playing in Mesoamerica?
Ball games were popular throughout Mesoamerica, and art depicting ball games exists in many Mesoamerican cultures, including the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec. Archaeologists have even discovered the ruins of sunken Olmec ball courts. Not much is known about the specific rules of the game. Mayan art depicts ball players wearing protective padding, and other art shows players wearing helmets and even leather belts. It is important to note that the game wasn't just for fun, it had a serious religious significance for those who played and watched. It is possible that some ball players were forced to participate against their will, and that human sacrifice played a role in the game. According to Mayan mythology, ball games were symbolic of the cycle of life, death, and regeneration.
Why are the Cubist paintings of Braque and Picasso so similar?
Even for scholars, it is sometimes nearly impossible to tell the work of Picasso and Braque apart. And it is possible that Cubism would not have developed at all without the competitive exchange of ideas that occurred during the dueling careers of these two artists. Both explored still lives, were intrigued by the physical properties of musical instruments, and often painted with similar color palettes. As Braque himself explained, "We were like two mountain climbers roped together," quoted in Stockstad 1079.
Who was Alberto Giacometti?
Alberto Giacometti, 1901–1966. Was a sculptor and painter born in the Italian-speaking portion of Switzerland. During his early career, he gained critical acclaim for his surrealist sculpture, and he was a formal member of the Surrealists until he left in the 1930s. Giacometti was inspired by the philosophy of existentialism and was friends with the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who even wrote a catalogue preface for one of Giacometti's Paris shows. His now iconic sculptures of bronze, skeletal human figures have been interpreted in relation to the state of society after the devastation of World War II. Interested in the experience of perception, Giacometti's lurching sculptures have also been described as shadows of the human form. In recent art auctions, his work has fetched tens of millions of dollars.
What is the Ishtar Gate?
The Ishtar Gate was a Neo-Babylonian, double-arched gateway with 4 towers, each featuring notched walls known as crenellations. The Ishtar Gate was originally over 40 feet tall, and the towers rose to nearly 100 feet. The deep blue brick structure was decorated with stylized lions and palm trees, an impressive fortification indeed. The monumental gate mirrored the wealth and extravagance of other Babylonian structures such as the Hanging Gardens, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. A reconstruction of the Ishtar Gate has been installed in a museum in Berlin, Germany.
Who was Master Gislibertus?
Although most medieval artisans created their work anonymously, the name of one key sculptor is widely known, that of Master Gislibertus, who worked in the first half of the 12th century. Gislibertus worked on a number of architectural projects throughout medieval France and Burgundy, but is most well known for his contributions to the sculptural decoration of the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare in Autun, France. Graceful, elongated figures and a unique compositional balance characterize his work, which often appeared in tympanums and historiated capitals.
What is a Rago image?
Arago was a type of image that warmly depicted the Amida Buddha welcoming dying souls to paradise. The Descent of the Amida Trinity is a Rago triptych from the Kamakura period in which the illuminated forms of the Amida Buddha and two Bodhisattvas appear to hover against a dark background. The radiant figures were done with gold paint and gold leaf, creating a contrast with the otherwise subdued silk surface of the triptych. The image emphasizes comfort and peace in the face of death.
What are the rock churches of Lalibela?
Lalibela was a medieval city in Ethiopia ruled by the Zagwe dynasty, which held power from 1137 until the end of the 13th century. The city was also an important Christian center and a popular pilgrimage route. And church building projects were possibly conceived of as the construction of a new Jerusalem in the Ethiopian mountains. At the behest of King Lalibela, Ethiopian Christians carved 11 churches out of red, volcanic rock, some of which are freestanding, while others are semi-detached and carved into rock walls. The churches are tall, narrow, and rectangular with a combination of arabesque and cruciform windows. These unique structures have been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site and remain an important site for Ethiopian Christians.
Why did Roy Lichtenstein paint comic book images?
Roy Lichtenstein, 1923 to 1997, whose early work reflected interest in Cubism and abstract expressionism, began to make his comic book paintings in the 1960s. With paintings such as Wham! 1963, and Eddie Diptych, 1962. Lichtenstein transformed comic images into monumental works of fine art by enlarging them and rendering them with the so-called Ben-Day dots used to print newspaper images. His approach has been described by some critics as a parody, but one in line with the goals of pop art. While Lichtenstein was able to transform the low art of comic books into fine art paintings, he also did the opposite. His yellow brush stroke, 1965, depicts a single smear of yellow paint. With so much detail it becomes nearly laughable, and completely banal. He also converted famous masterpieces, such as Vincent van Gogh's bedroom in Arles, 1888, into his iconic comic style. One of Lichtenstein's goals in creating these comic-like images was to encourage the viewer to question the way supposedly realistic paintings accurately depict reality.
What is the theatre at Epidaurus?
The theatre at Epidaurus, c. 350 BCE, was an example of ancient Greek civic architecture meant to be enjoyed by the general public. The art of the theatre was an important part of ancient Greek culture and religion, as religious ceremonies were incorporated with music and dance, and performed in public spaces. Greek drama, including tragedies and comedies, were performed in outdoor spaces like the theatre at Epidaurus. At the heart of the theatre was the circular orchestra, the central performance area. 55 rows of semicircular tiered seats were carved into a hillside, which allowed as many as 14,000 spectators a good view of the orchestra. The design of the theatre at Epidaurus is so effective that it is still in use today. And the acoustics are so perfect that no electrified sound system is needed when performances are held at the site.
Who was Joseph Cornell?
Joseph Cornell, 1903 to 1972, was a self-taught American artist and filmmaker from New York, who experimented with surrealist collage and assemblage, and is most celebrated for his shadow boxes filled with meticulously curated objets trouvés, found objects, which exhibit the artist's eclectic and intellectual interests from astronomy to arcades, from ballet to film. Cornell exhibited his work at the surrealist Julian Levy Gallery, bringing distinction to the art of assemblage. Cornell's boxes have been interpreted as constructivist, and have also been likened to visual poems, filled with surprising, often playful objects. For example, Homage to the Romantic Ballet, 1942, holds 6 frosted glass cubes on a reflective plate above a blue, velvet surface. On the inside of the lid is an inscription, a lyrical telling of a carriage ride on a moonlit night. Another piece, untitled, Hotel Eden, 1945, features a cutout of a tropical bird, whitewashed wood, and paint-splattered newsprint, which creates a nostalgic image of paradise. Many of Cornell's assemblages are on display at the Art Institute of Chicago.
What is the Raimondi Stela?
The Raimondi Stela depicts a human-like jaguar deity and is an example of Chavin-style art from the Peruvian Andes in South America. The Chavin culture, considered a mother culture to later Peru, developed between 1500 and 300 BCE. And Chavin-style art emphasized complex abstract patterns and featured animals such as jaguars and eagles. The jaguar creature carved on the Raimondi Stela is known as the staff god. It is depicted wearing an elaborate headdress made from stacked, serpentine monster heads. This interweaving image emphasizes balance and symmetry in its abstract design.
What are the sappy salt cellars?
Sappy salt cellars, made of ivory, were a result of Portuguese trade relationships with artists along the coast of West Africa. The Portuguese commissioned luxury goods such as spoons, forks, decorative boxes, and salt cellars. At the time, salt was itself a luxury good that only the rich could afford. and an exotic, carved salt cellar was a symbol of wealth. Art historians have identified what they think are three individual Sapi carvers who produced much of the work. The styles of the salt cellars are a blend of African and Portuguese influence, mixing Christian imagery and European hunting scenes with royal iconography familiar within the Benin art historical tradition. In a way, the Sapi salt cellars are the first example of tourist art in Africa, as these were objects created with the intention of exporting them.
Who is Gabriel Orozco?
Gabriel Orozco, 1962, is a Mexican artist from Jalapa, Veracruz, whose work, including sculpture, photographs, and installations, often subtly alters found objects and is intellectually complex. For example, in the early 1990s, Orozco chopped up a Citroën DS automobile and reduced its width by 2/3. Making us think differently about commonly perceived objects.
What is the difference between Art Nouveau and Art Déco?
Art Nouveau and Art Déco were both design movements that flourished in the early 20th century. Art Nouveau was established before Art Déco, and even influenced it. Art Nouveau designs tend to be busier and more ornate, with curving, organic lines. Art Nouveau artists include Alphonse Mucha and Théophile Alexander Steinlen. The designer of the still popular Tournée du Chat Noir posters. Art Déco is also ornamental, however. It tends to be more geometric due to the influence of Cubism and Futurism. Art Déco was popular during the Great Depression, the Empire State Building. Completed in 1931, is an example of Art Déco architecture, as are many of the jewelry designs of Georges Fouquet and many poster designs of the era.
Where can I find art resources online?
There are so many websites about art that looking up art online can turn into information overload. Here are a select few websites with a wealth of information on art, presented in a straightforward and often entertaining way. Heilbronn Timeline of Art History at the Metropolitan Museum of New York. http://www.metmuseum.org/toah. This incredibly detailed site combines detailed explanations of art movements and styles with explanations of specific works of art held in the museum's collection. It is a great resource for Western and non-Western art alike. If you can't make it to New York, looking at the Met Museum's timeline of art history is the next best thing. Google Art Project, http://www.googleartproject.com. A visit to Google Art Project is like stepping into a virtual museum. Rome, the halls of the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles. The Uffizi Gallery in Florence, or the Tate Britain in London. Dozens of museums opened their doors to Google in 2011, allowing cameras to film their interiors in a manner similar to Google Street View. After broadening the project's scope in 2012, tens of thousands of works of art from around the world can be seen online through the Google Art Project. Smart History presented by the Khan Academy, http://smarthistory.khanacademy.org/. Smart History is a great place to learn more about art movements and specific works of art. The site provides written essays, and video and audio guides to some of the most famous paintings, sculptures, and works of architecture around the world. Recently, Smart History has made an effort to include non-Western art. Smart History multimedia presentations are engaging and highly informative.
What is a Hopi Katsina figure?
The Hopi people, whose name means peaceful ones, are Native Americans from the American Southwest. In the Hopi religion, Katsinas, or Kachinas, are important benevolent spirits that personify natural elements in the real world. Representations of Katsina spirits are an important part of ritual dance. When Katsina dancers ceremonially impersonate the spirits, carved figures representing Katsinas are also an important part of the Hopi religious and artistic tradition. Carved Katsina figures can be given to children as presents and as educational tools. Katsina spirits are often associated with rain-bringing deities, or deities related to fertility or hunting. Hopi Katsina 232 figures are often made of carved cottonwood roots and decorated with feathers. They are painted with diverse patterns and symbols. For example, geometric patterns that symbolize water, and lightning bolts that symbolize rain and storms.
What is a psalter?
A psalter is a book containing the text of the Book of Psalms from the Old Testament. The most famous Carolingian psalter is the Utrecht Psalter, known for its lively ink drawings. The manuscript was produced at the Imperial Scriptorium in Reims. In modern-day France, in the first half of the 9th century. The illustrations of the Utrecht Psalter incorporate architectural and landscape scenes, and the text features Roman-style majuscules. As psalms are not narrative, they are challenging to illustrate. The artists who created the Utrecht Psalter illustrated them by expressively visualizing specific phrases from the text.
What is Chan Buddhism?
Chan Buddhism, known in Japan as Zen Buddhism, is a school of Mahayana Buddhism that developed in China in the 6th century and gained importance during the Song dynasties. Chan Buddhist philosophy emphasizes the direct experience of the individual and enlightenment through meditation. While some Chan Buddhists believe enlightenment through meditation takes a lifetime to achieve, others believe enlightenment can be achieved suddenly, in a flash of understanding. Chan Buddhism had a large impact on Chinese painting. The 13th century painter Liang Kai's simple, yet expressive, hanging scroll. 6th Chan patriarch chopping bamboo, depicts a crouching patriarch who suddenly achieves enlightenment after hearing the sound of his blade striking bamboo wood.
What is body art?
In body art, the artist's body becomes the medium. Body art overlaps with many other forms and styles, such as performance art. It became popular during the 1960s, likely as a reaction against the cold austerity of minimalism. Examples of body art include Bruce Naumann's photograph, Self-Portrait as a Fountain, 1966 to 1967. In which the artist's body takes on the characteristics of a fountain as water squirts from his mouth. An example of conceptual body art is Piero Manzoni's living sculpture, 1961, in which the artist signed the bodies of living women.
Who is Bill Viola?
Bill Viola, 1951, is a contemporary video and sound artist known for exploring the role of technology in his work and his video and audio. One of his most well-known and emotionally powerful pieces is Heaven and Earth. 1992, a sculptural installation in which two video monitors face one another. One monitor displays a scene of the artist's mother on her deathbed while the other screen plays a scene of his nearly newborn son, juxtaposing the beginning of life with the end. Because of the highly reflective surface of the screens, the death and birth scenes merge into one. Viola's larger installations can create a completely immersive environment through video and audio projection, making the viewer a part of the art. Viola's 1976 work, He Weeps for You, used video to allow gallery visitors to see and hear themselves reflected in a water droplet that slowly falls from a brass valve. An image that was magnified on a large screen.
What is the hours of Jean d'Oeuvres?
The Hours of Jean d'Oeuvres is a 14th century book of hours illuminated by an artist named Jean Pucelle and was a gift from French King Charles IV to his third wife, Jean d'Oeuvres. The book may be tiny in terms of physical dimension. Only a few inches, in fact, but is big in terms of artistic innovation. It is known for its grisaille illustrations which feature a gray, monochrome style that results in unique, sculpturesque figures. The illuminations, which often incorporate examples of Gothic architecture into the background, are innovatively rendered using spatial recession, creating a sense of depth not seen in earlier medieval painting.
What is performance art?
Performance art is slightly more complicated than its name might suggest. Performance art is indeed art that blends music, theatrical performance, and visual art, rather than a single painting or sculpture. But, the form itself, which became more popular in the 1960s, also blurs the line between art and artist, and frequently produces an uncomfortable reaction amongst viewers. For example, the artists Gilbert and George sing for over 8 hours in their performance. The Singing Sculpture, 1969. In a performance piece titled How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare, 1968. The often provocative artist Joseph Beuys holds a dead hare in his arms while appearing to whisper to it. A good example of the way in which both art and artist merge is Yoko Ono's 1964 performance. Cut Piece, in which audience participants are invited to cut off pieces of Ono's clothing until none remain. This performance is also categorized as an example of Fluxus art.
How does Roman architecture differ from Greek architecture?
Greek and Roman architecture are together referred to as classical architecture, as they share many characteristics including an adherence to the classical Greek orders of architecture and a sense of symmetry and balance. But, there are some key differences. Whereas the Greeks favored marble, the Romans invented concrete, and they relied on this key building material in much of their architecture. Romans also emphasized circular forms and made extensive use of the arch, vault, and dome in their building projects, unlike the post and lintel structure of Greek buildings. While Greek buildings tended to feature cramped interiors built on a more human scale, Roman buildings had dramatically high ceilings and were generally more flamboyant than their Greek counterparts.
What makes the Mona Lisa such an enduring image, recognizable by millions of people around the world?
The Mona Lisa was painted by Leonardo da Vinci between 1503 and 1507. The painting itself, oil on panel, is quite small, 30 x 21 inches. It has been stolen and returned, appears to have had part of it cut away, and depicts a Florentine noblewoman against an enigmatic background. It is likely a portrait of a Florentine woman named Lisa Gherardini. Spend some time looking at the painting. at Lisa's cool expression as she stares out of the frame with her arms delicately crossed.
What is a ready-made?
A ready-made is an artistic concept that describes an existing functional object that no longer serves its intended purpose and that is instead considered for only its aesthetic value. The best example of a ready-made is Marcel Duchamp's fountain. 1917, a porcelain urinal Duchamp signed as R. Mutt and submitted as a work of art for an exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in New York. When Duchamp changed, or augmented, a pre-existing object, he called the work ready-made. The act of signing the urinal can be considered such a change. But a more complex example can be seen in Duchamp's LHOOQ, 1919. For this work, Duchamp took a found object, or a pre-existing object, in this case, a postcard of the Mona Lisa, upon which he drew a mustache. This act of aesthetic vandalism serves to question the authority of art history and the preeminence of so-called fine art. Duchamp's interest in ready-mades reflects Dada provocatism, humor, and irreverence. The concept influenced later artists such as Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and Andy Warhol. All artists who manipulated pre-existing images in their work to communicate new meanings.
What is the Colosseum?
The Colosseum is an ancient Roman stadium designed to seat 50,000 spectators for events such as gladiator and animal fights. Romans even held mock sea battles here, and were able to flood the arena for such events. Built between 72 and 80 CE. It was the largest Roman amphitheater and was originally known as the Flavian Amphitheater. The original central arena was nearly 30,000 square feet. And the whole structure is more than 600 feet in diameter. The facade of the building was made of 3 levels of 80 arch arcades. A row of arches, plus an attic level, and supported 6 tiers of seats. Under the seats, barrel-vaulted corridors allowed for the passage of athletes and animals. Each of the 3 arcade levels is decorated according to a different architectural order, which become more complex as the building rises. The first floor utilizes the simple Tuscan order, while the second and third floor incorporate elements from the Ionic and Corinthian order, respectively. The exterior had been faced with travertine, but this relatively expensive material has since been looted.
Who is Yinkashoni Bear, MBE?
Yinka Shonibare, 1962, is a British-Nigerian artist whose work takes many forms, including video, photography, installation, and performance. Some of his most well-known work questions racial identity, and relationships between cultures in a post-colonial world. His sculptural work, Scramble for Africa, 2003, depicts headless European leaders dressed in European-style clothes made with African-printed fabrics as they divide up the resources of the continent amongst themselves. He was made a member of the British Empire, MBE, by Britain's Queen Elizabeth II in 2005.
Who was Vincent van Gogh?
During his lifetime, Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh, 1853 to 1890, was not well understood. And he died young, at the age of 37, of a gunshot wound. Although no gun was ever found, his death has always been considered a suicide. He suffered intense bouts of depression, spent time in an asylum in southern France, and is, of course, famous for cutting off his own ear, though this story has its critics. A violent event that was documented in Van Gogh's self-portrait with bandaged ear, 1889. Although Van Gogh's troubled life receives a great deal of attention, it is his incredible artistic talent that endures. His paintings, such as The Starry Night, 1889, Bedroom in Arles, 1888. Still Life, Vase with 12 Sunflowers, 1888. And his many expressive self-portraits are among the most highly sought-after works of art in the world. His goal was to create art that would appeal to everyone, not only the rich who could afford fine art. In Paris, he saw the brilliant colors of the Impressionists, and was fascinated by Japanese ukiyo-e paintings. Inspired by pointillism, Van Gogh experimented with fragmented brush strokes to create brightness and energy in his work. And he attempted to communicate intensity and emotion through expressive color and forms. His work was highly textured, dynamic, and an important part of the newly developing Expressionist style, a modernist movement that also included Edvard Munch and later included Franz Marc, Vasily Kandinsky, and Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. Van Gogh was active for a mere 10 years, and during that time he produced some of the most iconic images in Western art: An Empty Chair, The Lurching Room at his home in Arles, the dark undulations of a cypress tree perched along the horizon.
What was so shocking about Manet's paintings?
Manet's Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, The Luncheon on the Grass, 1863, was couched in art historical tradition, and draws clear connections to a 16th-century painting from the Venetian Renaissance called the Pastoral Concert, which also depicts a small gathering of minstrels and partially nude women relaxing in a country setting. The nudity alone was not enough to shock 19th-century viewers, but it was apparently the contrast between the well-dressed men and the complete nudity of the central female figure whose stairs confidently outform the picture plane that pushed it over the top. She, and a semi-naked bather in the background, were interpreted as prostitutes. Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe was not a neoclassical work, nor a modest depiction of female beauty as was common from the Renaissance, but a bold portrayal of contemporary figures engaging in what was perceived of as immoral behavior. Manet's equally shocking Olympia, 1863, also drew on Renaissance predecessors. Specifically Titian's Venus of Urbino, but instead of a demure reclining nude. Manet presented a boldly staring woman who confronts the viewer with her nudity. While in Titian's painting, a small dog, a symbol of loyalty, is curled asleep at the foot of the bed. Manet's painting includes a black cat with yellow eyes and an arched back. Though both of these paintings were shocking to the public, they were hailed by some, including Émile Zola, as masterpieces for their ability to communicate truth through realism, and for confronting traditional approaches to painting.
What is feminist art?
Feminist art began in the 1960s. Developing out of the politically and socially motivated women's liberation movement. The goal of feminist art was to reinterpret art history, which was deemed to be systematically sexist, and to promote women's contributions to art and culture. Women have been making art throughout history, and yet art made by women, for example, ceramics, jewelry, and textiles, has traditionally been categorized as a craft, which is held in less regard than so-called works of fine art, such as painting or sculpture. Feminist artists aimed to raise the status of craft, much in the way that Renaissance artists aimed to raise the status of the artist during the 16th and 17th centuries. During the 1960s and 1970s, men were disproportionately represented by art galleries, and women artists formed their own groups and collective galleries to promote their work. Feminist art groups included War, Women Artists in Revolution, and the Feminist Art Program. Established by pioneering feminist artists Judy Chicago, 1939, and Miriam Shapiro, 1923, in Southern California. Artists who worked with the early feminist art movement were also associated with other movements and styles, including minimalism, conceptual art, and installation art.
What is the Great Mosque at Córdoba?
During the 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate reached as far east as India, and as far west as Spain and Portugal, a region known in Arabic as Al-Andalus. The city of Córdoba was the capital of Al-Andalus, and was home to one of the most impressive examples of mosque architecture in the Islamic world. The Great Mosque of Córdoba was one of the largest mosques ever built. It has no central altar or shrine, but features a prayer hall that reaches over 250,000 square feet. Besides its large size, the Great Mosque's prayer hall is notable for its use of hypostyle, creating the effect of a forest of columns that supports double rows of horseshoe-shaped arches made up of red and white bricks, called voussoirs. As a result, the Great Mosque's hypostyle hall feels immensely large. Artists and architects continued to work on the Great Mosque for over 200 years after its initial construction, adding geometric marble carvings, grand mosaics, public fountains, and gardens. After Spain was conquered by Christians in the 15th century, the Great Mosque was converted into a cathedral.
What is conceptual art?
Conceptual art had existed in various forms for decades, but solidified into a major movement in the 1960s and 1970s. Inspired greatly by Dada and the art of Marcel Duchamp, conceptual art is concerned with the intellectual process of art. The artist Sol LeWitt's 1967 article, Paragraphs on Conceptual Art, did much to explain the foundations of the movement. An idea alone can be a work of art. Conceptual art is extremely diverse and a large number of international artists are associated with it. Conceptual art can be anything from written documents to photographs, videos to performances. The work of Belgian artist Marcel Breuthers, 1924 to 1976, is a good example of conceptual art. Breuthers was a writer, filmmaker, and visual artist. Perhaps his most celebrated piece, Musée d'Art Moderne, Département d'Eagles, Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles, 1968. Was an installation at his home in Brussels that described a completely fictitious museum. Besides the fact that Breuthers created posters, descriptions, and signs, the museum did not exist. The central idea of this piece was to question the authority of the museum as an institution. Conceptual art continues to be a major part of contemporary art today.
What is the Caroline script?
In the early medieval period, scribes were responsible for hand-copying illuminated manuscripts. And although these scribes were specially trained, penmanship was overall quite poor, and scribes did not follow a specific set of rules when writing. During the Carolingian period, Carolingian is an adjective used to indicate the rule of Charlemagne and his descendants. A new system of writing was developed, which resulted in much greater consistency from scriptorium to scriptorium. The use of majuscules, or capital letters, was based on the ancient Roman alphabet. Majuscules were used in titles and headings, and on only the most formal manuscripts. Lowercase letters, or minuscules, were quicker and easier overall, and were used for less formal writing.
Why was Honor Daumier arrested?
Honor Daumier, 1808–1879, was a painter and famous lithographer whose cartoons were regular features in Parisian newspapers. His realist works tended to focus on the plight of the urban poor and frequently criticized the French government, including Louis Philippe, which got him into trouble. His 1831 lithograph, Gargantua, published in the comic journal La Caricature, depicted the king as Gargantua, a grotesque character from the books of French Renaissance writer Rabelais. The king is large and bloated, with thin legs and a pointed head. He sits, enthroned, while poverty-stricken French subjects carry heavy loads of offerings in baskets up a ramp, directly to the king's open mouth. Aristocratic scavengers huddle underneath the ramp, hoping to catch any dropping coins. While in the far right corner, a poor, malnourished woman attempts to feed her baby. Such a negative depiction of the king resulted in a fine of 500 francs and a 6-month jail term for Daumier on the charge of inciting contempt for the government and personally insulting the king. This punishment did not stop the artist, as in a later lithograph, called Freedom of the Press. 1834, Daumier aggressively criticized government censorship. The work of Honor Daumier demonstrates the role of art as social commentary as well as the power of both image and text.
What are Mistec mosaics?
The indigenous Mixtec people of Mexico and Central America were well known for their skills in pottery, metalworking, and mosaics. They used the mosaic technique to make brightly colored masks and used materials such as turquoise and pearl oyster shells to create colorful, luminescent pieces. The skull of the smoking mirror is a 16th century Mixtec mosaic mask that depicts the powerful god Tezcatlipoca. The mask itself is supported by a real human skull with the back removed and deerskin straps attached, enabling the mask to be worn. The eyes of the mask are made with reflective iron pyrite and white shells, while the face is decorated in white, black, and turquoise stripes. As the materials needed to create this mask, such as turquoise and black lignite, were difficult to source, it is clear that this was a highly valued object requiring time and effort to create. It also important to note that this mask was meant to be worn and had an important ritual function. The mask is now part of the collection at the British Museum.
What is significant about the standing male figure from Sangxingdui?
Shang artists, c. 1700 to 211 BCE, are well known for making bronze sculptures using the piece mold casting process, especially bronze vessels for water, wine, and food. but, when the standing male figure from Sangzingdui was discovered, it astonished scholars and changed the way they thought about ancient Chinese art. More than 8 feet tall, this towering male sculpture is highly abstracted with a long, cylindrical body, jutting elbows, and large, circular hands. Nothing quite like this had ever been discovered, and scholars now think there may have been other significant art-producing cultures separate from the Shang dynasty during this time.
What is an arcade?
An arcade is a series of arches, which are supported by piers or columns. Many medieval Christian churches contain interior arcades, as do many examples of Islamic architecture, including the Great Mosque at Córdoba.
What is a reliquary?
A reliquary is a vessel meant to hold a relic, or a surviving trace of a holy person. Many churches along pilgrimage routes displayed relics, which attracted traveling pilgrims. Miraculous powers were attributed to some relics, which could include preserved bodies, body parts, or the personal belongings of saints or important religious figures. Reliquaries could be as simple as a square box, or as elaborate as a fine sculpture. An example of a Romanesque reliquary is the statue of Saint Foy from the Abbey Church of Conques, holding the actual skull of Saint Foy. This 33-inch figurative sculpture has a wooden core and is covered in silver gilt and jewels.
What is the Sistine Chapel?
In a letter to a friend in 1508, Michelangelo admitted that he disliked painting and really didn't want to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, now one of the most famous ceilings in the world. It is located in the Vatican, the official residence of the Pope in Rome. The Sistine Chapel, named after Pope Sixtus IV, was designed to be the same size as the Temple of Solomon and was built between 1475 and 1481. The interior of the chapel is covered in frescoes depicting Christian subjects and themes. Pope Julius II personally asked for Michelangelo to paint the ceiling frescoes, and after he reluctantly accepted. Rumor also has it that the artist shut himself up in the chapel for 4 years, refusing to let anyone else in. That part of the story is very unlikely. Michelangelo would have needed the support of his workshop apprentices to complete the project in 4 years. Michelangelo did not paint the walls of the Sistine Chapel. That work was completed by other artists such as Sandro Botticelli and Domenico Ghirlandaio, Michelangelo's former master. The wall frescoes visually narrate scenes from the Bible, including the story of Moses and the life of Christ. On the ceiling, Michelangelo depicted numerous Old Testament scenes. including David and Goliath, the creation of Adam, the fall from paradise, and Judith and Holofernes. With hundreds of figures in multiple poses, various different scenes, plants, nature, and Eleusinian architectural elements, it's a wonder the Sistine Chapel isn't a sensory overload. But Michelangelo was able to infuse the entire 45 × 128-foot space with a sense of grace, calm, and awe.
What is a patron?
A patron is somebody, an individual or a group, or even a company or a museum, who pays an artist for a work of art, or otherwise supports an artist financially. Understanding patronage is an important part of the study of art history, as understanding the needs and desires of the patron can reveal insights into the meaning or purpose of a work of art. One of the most famous art patrons was the Medici family, a rich and powerful family that dominated the Italian city of Florence during the Renaissance. Cosimo de' Medici commissioned works by 16th-century artists Pontormo and Bronzino, and master artist Michelangelo received key early support from the Medici family. He even lived in the Medici home as a young apprentice, and attended Lorenzo de' Medici's School of Art. Patrons continue to wield considerable influence over the art world. In the early 20th century, American writer and art collector Gertrude Stein, along with her brother Leo Stein, supported artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse by buying their art at a time when their modern style was unpopular in the mainstream. More recently, Charles Saatchi, a British advertising executive, helped to support the careers of the Young British Artists, YBAs, a group that includes Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin. Saatchi collected work for his aptly named Saatchi Gallery. The art he bought and displayed in his gallery directly affected art tastes and monetary values. In 2010, Saatchi donated his gallery to the British public.
Who were the Etruscans?
The Etruscan civilization flourished in Italy for nearly 500 years, until the Etruscans were conquered by the Romans in 509 BCE. They controlled a fertile region known as Etruria, now called Tuscany. The art and culture of the ancient Etruscans were certainly influenced by the ancient Greeks. In fact, the Etruscans adopted a number of Greek gods into their pantheon. But, they also maintained a unique tradition of their own, and went on to influence the ancient Romans who absorbed their culture.
What was Joshua Reynolds' grand manner?
Joshua Reynolds, 1723 to 1792, was determined to elevate the status of British painting to that of the great masters of the Renaissance. And one of the ways in which he did this was to infuse his portraits With the grandeur and heroic idealism of the highest form of painting at the time, history painting. In his series of lectures, 15 Discourses on Art, Reynolds promoted the idea that contemporary British painters should paint in the great style of the old masters. His enormous, full-length portraits, such as Portrait of Jane Fleming, Countess of Harrington, 1778, and Lady Sarah Bunbury Sacrificing to the Graces, 1765, incorporate classical elements such as sculpture, vases, and architectural elements into the background to give his paintings an element of antiquity. In the latter portrait, Lady Bunbury is depicted as a Roman priestess, with her long Roman dress banded at the waist and pinned to the shoulder, as Lady Bunbury makes an offering to the three Graces. Her friend Lady Susan Fox Strangways kneels beside her. Reynolds has elevated this aristocratic portrait to a symbolic, meaningful painting that inspires reflection on female friendship and beauty.
Who are the young British artists?
The Young British Artists, YBAs, are a loosely affiliated group of contemporary artists working in London, many of whom trained at London's Goldsmiths College in the late 1980s. Many of the young British artists gained the support of wealthy patrons, such as advertising magnate and art collector Charles Saatchi. The young British artists included Damien Hirst, 1965, who curated a show of YBA work at a warehouse in 1988, putting the group on the map. Other members, such as Gary Hume and Fiona Ray, exhibited in this early show, while others Rachel Whiteread, 1963, and Tracy Emin, c. 1963, did not, but are also considered YBAs. The work of these artists is very diverse. Gary Hume and Fiona Ray are primarily painters, while Whiteread and Emin are known for their conceptual sculpture and installations.
Why is art so expensive?
This is essentially a question about the value of art as well as taste, which are not fixed. Artists and styles of art fall in and out of favor regularly, affecting a work's price and status. Paintings by Renaissance artist Sandro Botticelli were not always held in particularly high regard, from his death in the early 16th century until the mid-19th century. Botticelli's art was for the most part ignored by collectors and forgotten. As the 19th century art-buying elite rediscovered his work, its value went up dramatically. Botticelli's paintings are now amongst the most prized examples of Italian Renaissance art. In another example, Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh only achieved critical success after his death at age 37. Van Gogh's highly sought-after work now sells for millions of dollars.
Who is Jenny Halser?
Jenny Halser, 1950, is a conceptual artist known for text-based installations and public displays. Her earliest work was Truisms, 1977 to 1979, which consisted of anonymous posters hung up around New York City with one-line phrases such as "Protect me from what I want." Abuse of power comes as no surprise, and expiring for love is beautiful but stupid. Along with displaying these truisms on posters, Halser carved words into public benches, created T-shirts, hats, and more. Later in her career, she began to work with LED, light-emitting diode displays, which has garnered her much critical and popular success. For example, she created a 65-foot wide permanent LED display in the lobby of 7 World Trade Center in which text slowly scrolls. Halser writes many of her own texts, and during her later career she began to appropriate language from international poets as well as text from unclassified U.S. documents, including interrogation transcripts from Abu Ghraib in Iraq. In this case, Halser projects private words in a public space, emphasizing the difference between private and public communication.
Who were the 8?
The 8 was a group of American realist artists with diverse styles: Robert Henry, 1865 to 1929, Arthur B. Davies, 1863 to 1928, William Glackens, 1870 to 1938, Ernest Lawson, 1873 to 1939, George Lux, 1867 to 1933. Maurice Prendergast, 1858 to 1924, Everett Shinn, 1876 to 1953, and John Sloan, 1871 to 1951, all of whom were rejected by the National Academy for a spring exhibition in 1907. In response, they had their own show at the Macbeth Gallery in New York City in 1908. Many of these artists went on to be known as members of the Ashcan School, a group who made gritty, realistic paintings of urban life. Their one and only show as the 8 received mixed reviews, with some critics feeling that the underbelly urban life was not appropriate subject matter for art. But it went on to make a major impact on American realism in the 20th century. Though some use the terms the 8 and Ashcan School interchangeably, they are not exactly the same.
What is the stele of Hammurabi?
Hammurabi was a Babylonian king who ruled over the lands of Mesopotamia during the 2nd millennium B. CE. He is famous for his code of laws, the earliest known legal code. The code itself is carved into a 7-foot stele, a large slab of black diorite. And in it Hammurabi declares that his code will cause justice to prevail in the land and to destroy the wicked and the evil. that the strong might not oppress the weak nor the weak the strong, as quoted in Stockstad 38. At the top of the stele, above the written code, is a carving that depicts Hammurabi himself standing before the sun god Shamash. Shamash, who was also the Babylonian god of justice, is seated in his throne and is surrounded by symbols of power. He rests his feet on a mountain top, wears a long, elaborate robe, and offers a rod and rope circle in his hands. Hammurabi's arms are crossed respectfully in front of him, and he receives the laws as given to him by Shamash. The stele serves as a powerful marker of Hammurabi's high status and represents the divine inspiration of his code.
What are some examples of postmodern art?
Many postmodern art movements are described as neo-movements, because they respond to earlier modern styles or approaches. Here is a sampling. Neo-expressionism. Neo-expressionism is primarily focused on painting. Though 252 some sculpture is considered neo-expressionist, and first began in Germany in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Neo-expressionist paintings are usually vibrant, sometimes figurative, but often raw and self-aware. Neo-expressionist artists include Anselm Kiefer, 1945, from Germany, and the American Julian Schnabel, 1951, whose large, brash paintings have been highly financially successful. Neo-Geo. Neo-geometric conceptualism, or Neo-Geo, developed in New York City in the mid-1980s and is characterized by postmodern appropriation and a strong sense of irony. Artists associated with Neo-Geo include Peter Halley, 1953, and Ross Blecker, 1949, who brought new symbolic meaning to familiar modernist forms. Artists such as Ashley Bickerton, 1959, and Jeff Koons, 1955, are Neo-Geo artists more interested in consumer culture. And their art is sometimes also categorized as post-pop. Neopop. Neopop is another term for post-pop, an art movement that developed under the influence of pop art in the 1980s. Neopop artists include Haim Steinbach, 1944, Alan McCollum, 1949. Jeff Koons, 1955, Ashley Bickerton, 1959, and Takashi Murakami, 1961. Neopop artists frequently use pre-existing, everyday objects, also known as ready-mades, in their work and question the values of mainstream culture.